Man has been wrestling with questions from ancient times. Questions like, where did I come from? Why am I here? Am I just a cosmic accident? Or is there a purpose to my life? And stories have been told for thousands of years in an attempt to explore these deeper truths. As people sat around fires and listened to their elders, they'd begin to shape a vision of where they came from and where they were going. For people of any time, stories of origin or stories of identity and purpose, as it's hard for us to understand what we've been made for if we don't understand where we've come from. So I'd like to share with you a story about how man came to be. It answers the question, why is there something rather than nothing? It reveals why you were created and what gives you inherent dignity. It's an ancient tale, one that requires seeing the world through the eyes of people who lived in a very different time than we do. As I share it with you, I encourage you to remain curious and open-minded. It comes from the first book of the Bible, Genesis, where we read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." This is the beginning of the biblical story of creation, describing an earth without form and void, blanketed and permeated by darkness. Amid this nothingness, the Spirit of God began to move over the waters. Creation was beginning. God, the only being who can bring something into existence simply by speaking it into existence, said, "Let there be light." And light was created. There was the light of day and the darkness of night, and it was good. Next, God created a firmament amid the waters and called it heaven, and then gathered the water under heaven into one place, creating dry ground beneath. And that ground, that land, was called earth, and an abundance of vegetation came out from the ground. Stars, planets, and the sun filled the atmosphere above, and birds filled the sky. The waters were filled with sea creatures, and animals were created to inhabit the land. But something was missing. For all the goodness and beauty that had been created, there was no creature in God's own image. So God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." People, like God, by being more than just matter. God made people of matter and spirit, and he breathed his own life into mankind, creating living souls, sharing with them his own inherent dignity. Now, this is not the only story of creation ever told. Perhaps you've heard others. You may be familiar with the Enuma Elish, the Mesopotamian creation story. In the beginning, there were two gods, intermingling in the form of water. Apsu, the male god, was the sweet water, and Tiamat, the female, was the salty sea. And as the two came together, God sprang out of their union. And like most offspring, they were rowdy and loud. Apsu had no patience for it all and wanted to kill them, but Tiamat urged prudence. She also covered her bases and let her son Ea know what Apsu was planning. Ea killed Apsu, became the chief of the gods, and had a son named Marduk. And Marduk became the most powerful of all. And as controller of all the winds, he caused Tiamat no end of frustration. Some of the gods encouraged Tiamat to kill Marduk, which seemed to her like a good idea, and the two engaged in an epic battle, which Tiamat lost. And it was out of the carcass of her body that the world was created. Tiamat was split in two, gutted like a fish, the top half of her corpse forming the heavens and the lower half the earth. This was the creation of the world, and it was followed by the creation of humans. Why were humans created? To be the slaves of the gods. This was the dominant creation story being passed from one generation to the next at the time that the creation story of Genesis was written. And while both stories begin with movement and water, they paint very different pictures of how we came to be and why we are here. We read in Genesis 1:1, "In the beginning, God created." This was originally written in Hebrew, and the word translated created is bara. We find this word nowhere else. And what it means is something being created out of nothing. The world wasn't created out of the carcass of a goddess or as the result of sexual domination or war. It was brought into being, created out of nothing, because God, the Creator, wanted to share the goodness of his life with others. God wasn't lonely. He didn't need to create a fan club to worship him for all of eternity. God wasn't bored, and he didn't need help. Man wasn't created to be a slave or plaything. God created man in his own image, after his own likeness, male and female. And with this origin story, man's dignity comes from being made in God's image and likeness. It doesn't come from achievements, relationships, possessions, or perfect living. It doesn't come from man at all. The source of human dignity is God. Now, both of these creation stories are written in a literary style known as a myth. Neither one is intended to be read as a science textbook. But I'd like to propose that the creation story in Genesis is what we call a true myth. This is a literary technique wherein a myth conveys foundational truth. We hear the word myth and we think, oh, that's something that's not true. But myth is actually a method of explaining things that are difficult to put into a theorem. Why is it used? Because we learn best through story. We grasp stories, we relate to them, and as a result, we remember better. So this is a literary technique used incredibly effectively by authors like J.R.R. Tolkien. And while Tolkien believed that myths can convey foundational truth, he also believed that we have been fooled into believing that the word myth is synonymous with a lie. But the liars, he proposed, were actually the philosophers of materialism who taught that there is nothing supernatural in this universe. Tolkien thought that the materialist belief that what we see is all that exists actually kept us imprisoned in a world of mere matter. This, said Tolkien, was the true myth, this understanding of the world as limited to 3 dimensions and 4 senses. And he unapologetically believed in the transcendent and felt that acknowledging it was key to understanding man's identity and purpose. Which brings us back to our original questions. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Are we all just cosmic accidents, or do we have a purpose, a reason for living? It isn't just the ancients that wanted answers to these questions. So I invite you to take a further step with me, to consider the possibility of the more Tolkien was referring to. I ask you to consider what is perhaps a new framework for you, but a good one to explore in your quest to live life fully, which requires understanding who you are and why you are here. In this framework, there is an intelligent creator behind all that has been made. This designer created a world so complex, so fine-tuned, that even a slight change in gravity and the strong nuclear force which impacts the formation of hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon, or the physiology of biological organisms would mean that there would be no life on Earth. To think it is just a fluke that life on Earth is possible requires either a tremendous leap of faith or the existence of other universes. And yes, the existence of the multiverse would increase the statistical odds of our particular set of circumstances on Earth being possible. But if the multiverse exists, who is behind its creation? Who set it all into motion?